focus on vaccine development in the emerging markets, primarily Latin America, India, Africa, and China. So I come from the opposite side probably than many of the panelists, and that's from the development side of vaccines in phase 1 through phase 3 clinical trials.
Thank you very much, Renee. Well, given that I held off questions from the participants to the speakers, I want to first open it up to the audience and see if there are questions or anything here. We have a question up front and one in the back. Do we have someone with a microphone? We can start over here and then move up into the corner. I think we have a couple of different questions here. So right there.
Tim Cook from Novodyne. Thanks for 3 great presentations, first of all. Fantastic. I had 2 completely unrelated questions. The first one for Susan. I wondered whether you're out-licensing the rotavirus to the different manufacturers, where they have to meet a certain criteria like WHO qualification.
We did take into consideration that particular aspect. It wasn't necessarily a requirement, but something that certainly made them an attractive partner was whether they were in compliance to sell product to WHO and had already gone through that approval process.
Okay. Because it would seem that, I mean, you're licensing out, like in India there's 4, and in China there's 6.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got an awful lot of producers, and I guess I might be concerned that if one of the 10 wasn't WHO qualified or wasn't up to the kind of standard that you would want, you could potentially have a tainted product, you know, along the lines of what Peter was talking about, where if one of the producers is not making it properly and there's a problem, you know, it could reflect poorly on the product in general. So
It could. You're absolutely right, and that was something that we considered, but we also considered that there was a significant unmet health need in these regions, and we did our best through multiple exchanges with the companies and through surveys of people who were more familiar than we were with them to make sure that they were vetted to the best of our abilities and that they were legitimate partners. You're absolutely right. Transfer of technology to multiple partners does run the risks. If something goes wrong with one person, it has the possibility to contaminate everybody. But that's true of any technology in any field. You know, we saw that with the HIV vaccine and the failure of the Merck trials, and that's certainly, at least for the HIV vaccine that we're working on at the Vaccine Research Center at NIAID, that in part involves an adenoviral component that had a negative impact on moving that technology forward, even though they were 2 completely different programs.
I think that's a concern that anyone sharing their technologies had, but I do remember that in your presentation, many of the licenses had a territorial restriction.
That's
and
right.
WHO pre-qualification really deals with product that's made within one country and then supplied to others. WHO pre-qualification requirements aren't necessary in all cases superior to the national regulatory requirements, so it may well be that, you know, a license to a company within, let's say, India would be fully regulated by the DCGI, the Indian Regulatory Authority, and a lack of WHO pre-qualification, that may simply not be part of their business model. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't necessarily bring with it a quality hit. We had questions up here.
Oh, could I just do my second question?
Oh, sorry.
Which was unrelated, sorry. This is more for Alan or Peter. Just a question about in these emerging or southern markets, how do you integrate the vaccine business that you have with the rest of the company business, which is quite different in the case of Baxter and Sanofi Aventis? But how do you, in these kind of markets, work with the other part of the company, which is much bigger than your part?
Actually, everything that we've done so far that's had to do with either acquisition or partnership has been vaccine focused only. We haven't had to really focus on other products which would be part of a portfolio of a company that we were either partnering with or acquiring. Another answer to your question with a slightly different spin is how do you handle the partnership once it's put together? Or how do you handle the acquisition once it's put together? And there's a real risk for partnerships between large established multinational companies and smaller developing world companies. There's a difference in culture, there's a difference in approach, there's a difference in understanding. The words can have different meanings, and you have to manage this very, very carefully. For the most part, we've found that a management from a distance works best. If you try to actually make them you, or if you try to be them, it's a very, very difficult equation to make work. If you can allow them to do what it was that they were doing that made them attractive to you and you either acquired them or partnered with them, then I think that's probably the best thing. They know their area, they know their market, they know their unmet medical needs, they know what product development is, they know the regulation. And it's very difficult to transfer all of this to a large company and then back out again to the partner. So to a certain extent, as much arm's length as possible seems to be the best equation that we've worked with.
I'd like to follow up with a question before moving up to the corner here. It's sort of a corollary of what we just spoke about. When you're getting these products into other parts of the world, either through, say, marketing partnership, through a bulk supply and being locally fill finished, or actual primary manufacture, they still have to go through development and regulatory for the local markets. Generally, clinical trials, maybe other kinds of data or studies required. How do you handle the integration of that globally? How does data generated in one market or territory flow back to the others? I'm presuming that the U.S. FDA, if you have a version of the product, is going to want to know what you learned in India or in Brazil. How do you handle that integration of a global data set?
So from Baxter, we have a global regulatory team that collects that information from all of the different countries where clinical studies have happened. So between our clinical team and our global regulatory team, that information's captured. And Tim, just to, because we have a little different perspective, than Sanofi has. They've done a lot of partnering out in these countries, and we, from the highest level within Baxter, it's been established that the vaccine business is important to the future. And Baxter does business in over 120 countries where we actually have local Baxter offices, which in the case of regulatory filing really help us out quite a bit. Baxter has 3 divisions: the bioscience division, which vaccines is part of, but also includes some of our blood products such as factor VIII and our recombinant proteins. Also, we have an area of medication delivery, which is our IV products, IV solutions, and some of the different machinery used in IV delivery. Also, the third is our renal division, which is peritoneal dialysis and hemodialysis. They see an array of customers, everything from hospital-based customers to physicians. There is coordination of our sales forces, believe it or not. If there's a niche area, just to use an example with hepatitis B, if you have a product that you want to sell in the renal area, for pre-dialysis patients, we then go to this other area and ask to use their sales force. And with the top levels of the company saying vaccines are an important part of our future, they're much more willing to speak to us. So I think it really comes from the top down as you try to sort of coordinate the launches in various countries. I hope that adds to that answer.
Ellen, do you want to add any comments from Sanofi's perspective? You've gone through a series of acquisitions and different business units. Does the salesman carry a full service catalog, or do you tend to have a more focused vaccines channel?
Yeah, we do. We have vaccines are a division of the Sanofi-Aventis group, so it's pretty much an autonomous operation. There is, as I mentioned, the use of sales forces from the group for certain selected products which are going to meet markets where we don't have an established sales force. Say, for instance, we were going to put a nosocomial vaccine into a hospital. There's absolutely no sense in duplicating that kind of force. So it would go into the hospital, specialty hospital sales force. But by and large, everything within Sanofi Pasteur, from the discovery all the way out to the distribution of product, is handled within the company.
It's a separate division. Thank you. A question up here. I want to give an opportunity. Right there. Sure.
So Mark Esser from PPD Vaccines. My first question's for Susan. And you mentioned the perception about the original rotavirus vaccine and causing intussusception. And how was that perception managed when you look to partner with other companies in the developing world? In the worst case, them thinking they were getting an inferior product compared to what the US and Europe got.
Right, and then that was definitely a problem with subsequent interest in that original thing, even though it had the potential to be life-saving for so many. The mindset was, well, if it's not good enough for the U.S., why should we consider that for our particular region? In terms of where it's going now, we're taking that step back. We're going through complete, our partner is going through the new clinical trials, and of course the clinical trial hurdles for rotavirus have greatly increased because of the initial failures associated with the intussusception incidents. And further, within the NIH, there's been a real push and a real effort to show that the incidences of intussusception weren't actually associated with the vaccine itself. In fact, they were no different than the placebo incidence. And so it's been a kind of an education process as well, and kind of tearing down that negative original press. Just like with anything, I think the original negative reports all tend to stick in our minds, but then the subsequent follow-ups that say, oh, well, maybe it wasn't so bad as we thought, those tend to get lost and shuffled to the side. So we're working, though, to make those more widely known.
And then my second question for the whole panel, when you take vaccines into the developing world, where they have different existing vaccine menus and immunization schedules, how obligated are the countries or are the companies to demonstrating immunogenicity, looking at interference with existing immunization schedules, and even potentially showing efficacy in these new developing world countries?
Further extend that question a little bit. Do you have to accommodate or fit into the regional schedule, which are different in many countries? So it's not just forcing your schedule into what the country does, but do you have to adapt to the well-child schedule? So, I don't know, Renee, I'd like your little comment. I know you get involved with companies on...
Sure. I think that does depend on the country. I think, I do think that you do have to fit in with the immunizational schedule depending upon the particular country.
I think it's a lot of pre-planning as you look across the globe and decide where you're going to launch this product, and you get an idea of what the immunization schedule, especially with infants, looks like. So in the developing world where children, it's difficult sometimes to bring your infant in for vaccination, to try to get a schedule that fits in with the visits that are already happening are probably the best way of doing it. So looking at it globally, deciding what countries you want to actually launch this product in as you're designing the clinical trial. You may actually have to have some variation in the immunization schedule that you're using so you can therefore launch in a wider variety of markets, but very important. Anything to add, Alan?
No, I was going to say, I think we all know that you have very widely varying schedules of immunization in the emerging market. You can have, for instance, in a pediatric combination vaccine, you can have 246, you can have 234, 345, 357. And if you're going to make all of these things match so that they match up with the actual schedule in the country, then you end up with a trial with a lot of arms in it. In some cases, you're able to use data from a schedule, say, for instance, a 246 schedule for a 357, and it will be acceptable. But by and large, you have to understand what's going to be necessary for licensure.
Right.
And then you have to be willing to commit to what that's going to be, or you're going to spend a lot of time discussing why your approach is right, and you'll have people on the other side of the table spending a lot of time telling you why your approach is wrong.
So I would assume you probably fairly often you may qualify a vaccine based on a large field trial at say 2, 4, and 6,
Right.
and then find yourself for registration in a certain market having to do a small clinical trial to show serologic targets at 3, 4, and 6, or 3, 4, 5, or whatever it is within the region. It's an additional question over here.
Sorry.
Introduce
Sorry.
yourself.
Susan, I hate to pick on you, and I know a lot of people have asked you questions. I just want to follow on some of what Tim asked. I just really have a quick comment, and I think with all these different manufacturers, if one of them screws up, it could be completely detrimental to the whole rotavirus program, and particularly with the shadow that was over there that took a long time to educate against. I hope the NIH has some matrices in place to try and make sure that doesn't happen. And that's a comment. I don't expect a response. What I found curious, I think it was on your first or second slide, you had two statements. One said that the NIH preferred regional licenses for restricted territories. And then further down that slide, you had a statement that said, you must have global access requirements. And maybe I misunderstood, but I find those two statements completely diametrically opposed to each other. Can you perhaps tell me how they can both be met?
Sure. So I should, perhaps I was a bit misleading in the statements. The principles are things that we like to adhere to, and we do our best to adhere to them, but they don't always have to be implemented. It may not always be appropriate to a particular situation. For instance, if a company approaches us and they ask for a worldwide license, and they show that they have some reasonable plan together in which they're going to introduce a product into a number of countries around the world, we don't need to necessarily think about employing a geographic restriction in that case, especially if we don't have any other partners that are coming to the table, if the technology is perhaps getting a little bit older in age and it's been out there and people know about it and we still don't have any other players. We don't necessarily always need to restrict them based on the territory, based on the field. So a lot of factors go into the implementation of those principles. So historically, though, we have had a tendency to engage in worldwide licensing of rights, because that's, again, historically what Big Pharma and the biotechs that we have worked with are most interested in. It's only been in the more recent past, say the past 5 years or so, where we've gotten to know some of the players in these emerging markets and gotten to understand what their needs are, their desires are, and how we can best work together to get something to everybody. So I hope that answers your question.
Well, we're maybe accumulating additional, oh, sorry, there's a question. Okay. I have a question I'd like to launch while we look for some more from the participants. Could you address a little bit how combination vaccines play into the globalization and introduction of the emerging markets? Many of the products we're talking about in the U.S. and EU markets and Japan are defined combinations. Some vaccines, like pertussis, we don't offer as a standalone at all. In some of the markets that you want to enter, they may have their own versions already established. So if you're trying to introduce a Hib vaccine, just to pick on one example, do you find you need to cut a deal where they can combine your Hib with their, let's say, wholesale DTP? Do you find yourselves needing to, find some accommodation so that you can get a DTP Hep B or a DTP Hib or whatever? So how does that complexity fit into globalization and entry into the emerging markets?
Do you want to
Alan,
take a swing
please.
at that? Sure. There are markets in the world that believe that acellular pertussis is the way to go. There are other markets in the world that believe that wholesale pertussis is the way to go. And the debate rages on. It's particularly prevalent in the emerging markets. I don't have an opinion in terms of wholesale versus acellular based on efficacy and safety. I think there's a lot of data that has been evaluated, can be evaluated, and I'm not really in a position to draw a conclusion. But I do know that if you're going to participate in these markets, you can't do it by saying you're wrong and we're right. That's not the equation for success. So in markets, for example, where wholesale pertussis is a rule and has been used for years, decades even, with success, if you're going to build a pediatric combination product consisting of diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Haemophilus influenza, hepatitis B, and potentially even polio, you're going to build it on a wholesale base. That's what you're going to build. Right? If you're in a market where a cellular pertussis has come in and wholesale has been displaced, then it's going to be closer to what you would consider to be sort of a developed market approach. But I think the companies have to be flexible enough to accommodate the needs of the market. You can't do a one-size-fits-all approach for combination vaccines, I don't think. And there is also issues with regard to, do you put Haemophilus influenza into a combination, or do you leave it with hepatitis B? Do you treat it separately? Is it lye or is it liquid? And it's different in different countries around the globe. A lot of it has to do with convincing the key opinion leaders that one approach is better than another. They will subsequently talk to their ministries, they will talk to their institutes, they'll talk to the constituents and the manufacturers, and you'll generate a consensus, and you will need to work with that consensus. So I think that as you participate more broadly in the emerging markets, you have to, I hesitate to use the word understand, but you have to be willing and ready to provide the vaccines that they need for their markets.
Peter, any additional comments on how to meet the local situation, preferences for combinations?
Sure. As we know, some of the emerging markets, China, India, for example, Brazil, have local production of some of the components that are used in combination vaccines. And see, I interpreted your question to be if you were to bring in another component from, let's say, Sanofi.
It's exactly part of my question.
Okay.
And Alan addressed part of it, and you're now picking up on
Good.
it.
So it's very timely because we've just recently had discussions about that. The issue is that, and it depends on the country where this product is being developed and potentially launched in, is whether it's considered a brand new product. And you literally are starting from phase one again on a product that maybe in other markets is already established. It's just you're switching out a component with a locally manufactured component. So our experience has been they've erred on the side of being conservative. You literally have a brand new product with that small change. And in the local market, it scares them once they find out the cost associated with those clinical studies.
Is it possible to sort of regionalize the clinical development? I mean, I assume one of the biggest costs that scares the people is, oh my God, they're going to really treat this as a new product. I've got to go out and do, at the very least, consistency lot trials, and maybe they're going to ask me to accumulate efficacy data. When you're facing that kind of thing, can you regionalize it? Can you look at, well, there are similar requirements for South America, Brazil, Argentina, or do you need to customize it by country? Is it a country by country, or can you regionalize? Are there economies of developing?
I think it depends, Lance, on the region. There are strong local manufacturers in almost all the regions, and they tend to set the standard for their region. They're referred to, they're referenced, their opinions are solicited in terms of the products that other countries will put in. I mean, there are countries where you can sell products based on a free sale certificate. It's approved here and it matches up with their schedule, then you can do that. But that's becoming a smaller and smaller playing field all the time. So I think that it is possible to do regional development.
Yeah.
And I think you need to do that in consultation with the regional leaders so that they understand it. The place where it's most difficult, or more difficult, is Asia Pacific, where within that region you have many strong organizations who are either government associated or state run or biotech companies that are aligned very, very closely with those other two components. And they have different ways of doing things. So when you're in Asia Pacific, it's slightly different.
So, Peter,
China-
sorry, Renee,
And
please.
China is certainly a market where you have to do the development of the vaccine in the Chinese population.
Well, China is kind of a region as well as a country,
Right,
given its
right,
size.
yes.
Yeah, special consideration there.
Special consideration.
Right. I think Peter touched on it a little bit, but in my own experience, I worked on a JE vaccine, which was being developed in the U.S., and we met with the Japanese regulatory authority, and they were very interested in the product. They thought it was probably a good match. However, in the little closed meeting, they said, and by the way, you will never register it in Japan except through a local Japanese company. Do you still find that frequently? And I don't mean to pick on Japan so much, but I mean, is that a common finding that you need to have a local vehicle to participate in the licensing?
I've found it in Asia Pacific more than any other region, especially in some of the newer markets that we're entering. China is an example. Japan certainly is another example. They've made it clear that having a local company involved will, in a sense, grease the skids and make things happen quite a bit easier. But even countries like Cambodia and Vietnam, they would like to get local people involved because it raises the overall knowledge of the business for that country.
I mean, certainly these interests in distributed, localized manufacture have been very long-standing.
Right.
I said I've been in the vaccine business 30 years. 30 years ago, I was in a U.S. State Department group called BOSTED, which was global, and the objectives were clearly to foster the creation of manufacturing capacities in other countries, and every country wants a degree of self-reliance. Have we accumulated an additional question? If not, I have one or two topics that I'd like to foster. We have a question up here, or somebody can bring the mic.
Yeah, I'll just say, you can repeat it. So one is to thank everyone. I thought this is a very excellent presentation. But my follow-up to all of this is, the WHO has been a very significant mover in the emerging markets. What's your experience, and since you're willing to project sales growth over the next 4 or 5 years, what do you think is going to happen with WHO sort of dictating EPI schedule, EPI vaccines, the provision of those vaccines as we go forward?
Are we going to see a global market driven by WHO? Alan?
Yeah, I think that you have a lot of the countries in the emerging world who are looking at WHO standards in terms of how they manufacture their product, in terms of what vaccines they should put into their schedule. I think the WHO will continue to not necessarily dictate, but strongly suggest, just short of mandating, what vaccines should be included in schedules. But I think as the countries become stronger themselves, each of their ministries of health, whether it's Ministry of Science or Ministry of Health, are going to take a look at these. And I suspect that there will be discussions between the WHO and the individual countries in terms of what's best. As these countries sort of advance in terms of vaccines, their voices will be stronger. And the need for sort of a single body to, beneficially provide and set standards for vaccines for these countries, I think will decrease over time. Now, don't get me wrong, I think that the WHO has done an absolutely excellent job in what they've done for vaccines, and I have absolutely no issues there, but I do think that there'll be stronger voices from the individual countries, and WHO pre-qualification, I think, will become more of a dialogue kind of situation as opposed to this is what we'd like you to do situation. That's my projection.
I'd like to expand on that just a little bit, and this is relevant to, I think, all of the panelists. So my little company, Immunobiologics, is currently working in Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, and some related markets. One of the things that we've seen very clearly is there is a WHO-driven market and a WHO vaccine activity, but there is also a separate private vaccine market. And the products they use are different, and pricing and channels are different. Do you find that in a lot of other parts of the world that there is, I think both of Alan and Peter in some of your slides identified a proportion private and a proportion public. Do you find those kind of distinctions between an EPI-like market, the products that are Gavi or UNICEF funded versus those that the more affluent segment of the population buys?
I certainly do. You mentioned Mexico, Alan, in your presentation, and look at the private versus the public market, which I think is a great example of that, where the public market tends to be more the PAHO purchased product. The private market is a Western, let's call it that, or a Northern produced product, and sometimes even outside the schedule. For example, meningitis C, now people are starting to use that in Mexico, although it's not even part of the schedule yet. They're looking towards the United States or down to some of the other regions and saying, what are our children, for the people that can afford it, what other diseases can we protect our children against that are not being protected under our local immunization schedule? But being part of the vaccine business and part of a healthcare company, we tend to look at really the return on investment as we look at future products. And, some of the companies, Sanofi being one, GSK certainly being another, has stood up and said, you know what, we can price differently in different markets. Mm-hmm. And I think the developed market understands that and says, you know what, it is okay that you're offering it at a discount in some of these developing markets, because we would like to see them succeed in their healthcare also. But I think as we develop new products, it's important to not only look at that return on investment, but also look at global health impact as a variable in analyzing any program.
So that gets to an old question. I hope it's been completely resolved and put to bed. It is a government question. Susan probably has to deal with it at some point. Historically, I know that Sanofi had to, and I'm sure Baxter. Historically, well, in fact, today we have something in the U.S. Most commonly encountered as GSA pricing. We have laws which, at least nominally, say that you may not sell to the U.S. government at a higher price than you sell to your other customers. And historically, that's been cited as a barrier and a reason that many U.S. companies, in fact, did not offer the same product in other countries. The tiered pricing, was one of the fundamental enablers of global supplies. Are we still in a workaround situation? Has that law been changed? Do you find it a barrier? Do you find that you are able to sell the same product, the same formulation, in the U.S. and sell it at a significantly lower cost in other countries? Is this still a problem?
Not for me.
Okay, so you don't encounter this as something you have to bat up against today.
No, I think, Lance, this is a sort of a description of the situation that exists.
Yeah.
I think that if you take a look at the different economies of the world based on GNI and things like that, it's not hard to understand that there's a certain amount that can be spent on medicines, on vaccines, and things like that. Many of the countries in the emerging markets are still spending their money on shelter, food, housing, education, okay? And these are not the countries that are going to be paying $15 or $20 a dose for vaccines. It's not going to happen.
Yeah. No question that for the manufacturers, they understand it, they are global. You do deal in those countries. I guess my question was, does anybody in the U.S. government ever come back to you and say, wait a minute, how come we're having to pay $300 for a course of a particular vaccine here, and yet they're able to get it for, 16 in, some of the third world areas.
I think we're more apt to see that when they compare it to maybe Canadian prices that are fairly close to us than some of the third world or developing world pricing.
So you're not seeing it as a hard edge problem?
No, and even at that, I think they realize the amount of funding that needs to go into research and development to develop these new products, right. Especially being a U.S.-based company, they look at it as an opportunity to move healthcare forward specifically in the U.S., but also obviously globally.
So Susan, do you find that you're often asked to have different royalty rates for the Gavi markets or the UNICEF markets versus for US and EU?
That's actually one of the things that we proactively offer in our licenses for technologies that do find their primary markets in those developing regions. We do offer a tiered royalty structure as an enticement to the company to make sure the product gets to where it will really have an impact.
And although the general focus of this has very much been on the emerging markets, what about in the cases where you're being asked to license a technology that would be used for a product in the U.S., whether it's, say, a general use vaccine, like the rotavirus, for example, or in a biodefense context? So do you look, I mean, you're certainly going to have a royalty burden on a product that might have $1 billion or $3 billion market. But what happens when the sales or the proportion of the sales that are to the government? So is it the same royalty burden on products that's sold into the Vaccines for Children program? Is it the same that's sold into a stockpile where there's no real intent or no hope that we'll never use it?
Yeah, there's some complicated rules, as you kind of alluded to, and that govern our ability to collect royalties back on sales to ourselves. And I think it's important to make a distinction that there are also not only, at least within the U.S., you might sell to the federal government, you might also be dealing with state governments. And those are two completely different situations
And so it's all customized.
to deal with. So everything's kind of on a case-by-case basis.
We're about ready for a coffee break. Are there any burning questions that we haven't touched on yet? All right. Well, I'd like to thank the panelists then for what was very informative.